this isn't easy for any of us.
And that is why we must consider all the facts before
There was a
us.
small white index card in my coat pocket the night of the scholarship ceremony. I had been folding and unfolding it in the car on the way over. The card had 3 sentences on it, written in my own handwriting, in blue pen, about an hour earlier in the kitchen of my small house. The sentences had been the version of what I might say at the ceremony if my son's name was actually called and if I was actually asked to stand up. I had not been asked to prepare anything. I had written the card anyway, because I had been the kind of mother who prepared for the sentence she might be asked to say, in case the room turned to look at her and she needed something to hold on to. I had not been planning to use the card. I had been planning to listen to my son's name being called, and to clap and to cry quietly into the small navy handkerchief my husband Yarik had given me before we had left the house. The handkerchief had belonged to his grandfather. He had been giving me his grandfather's handkerchiefs for the 11 years we had been married, every time he thought I might need one. I had been carrying them in my purse and my coat pocket and the glove compartment of our car for over a decade. The reason I am telling you about the card and the handkerchief, before I tell you what happened at the ceremony, is that the small objects in my pockets that night were the things I had brought with me to keep myself steady. I had not known, when I had been folding and unfolding the card in the car, that the people in the row behind me were going to be the people they turned out to be. I had not known that my husband was going to put his hand on my knee and squeeze it the way he had squeezed it twice before in 11 years of marriage, both of which had been on nights I would remember for the rest of my life. I had not known that my son, who had been 17 years old, who had been wearing a dark green tie his cousin Sevda had picked out for him, who had been sitting in the front row of the school auditorium with the other scholarship recipients, was going to do what he did at the microphone. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand. The night of my son's scholarship ceremony was the night 2 families I had been carrying for 16 years collapsed into one room, and the deciding of who was actually his family was not done by me, and was not done by them, and was done, slowly and very deliberately, by a 17-year-old boy in a green tie who had been quietly waiting to be old enough to do the deciding himself. My name is Imelda Pavlenko. I am 35 years old. I am a hospice social worker. I have spent the last 12 years of my career sitting with people who are dying, and with the families those people are dying around. And the work has taught me a number of things about what families actually are versus what families tell each other they are. The work has been useful for what I am about to tell you. The work has also been the thing that has paid for most of the life my son and I have been able to build in our small house in upstate New York, after I had figured out, at 20, how to leave the people who had told everybody they had thrown me out, and how to find my way back to the people who had been waiting to take me in. Before I tell you about the scholarship ceremony, hit subscribe, and tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a family in your life that pretended to be the one that raised you, when the actual people who raised you were a different family entirely. Tell me how old you were when you finally figured it out. Tell me whether anybody else in your life had figured it out first, and had been waiting for you to catch up. I read every single comment. Now, let me take you back to when I was 19, because the story does not work without me explaining the version of 19 that I had been. I want to tell you about the family that threw me out. They were not my biological parents. I want you to understand this from the start. They were the people I had called mom and dad for the first 19 years of my life, but they had been my foster parents, who had taken me in when I was 6, after my biological parents, my actual mother and father, had gone through a difficult period that had required them to temporarily place me in foster care. The placement had been supposed to last a few months. The few months had become 6 years. The reason it had become 6 years is the seed of the entire story, and I want to tell it to you carefully. My biological parents, Irina and Stepan Pavlenko, had emigrated from Ukraine in the late 1980s, when they had been in their 20s. They had been newly married. My grandfather Alexei, on my father's side, had been a writer in Ukraine who had been targeted by the Soviet authorities for the kind of journalism he had been doing in the years before perestroika. The whole family had come over together. My father had been 26. My mother had been 24. They had settled in upstate New York, in a small town where a Ukrainian Catholic parish had been welcoming new immigrants. My father had taken a job as a maintenance worker at a small Catholic hospital. My mother had taken a job as a cleaner at the same hospital. They had worked there together for years. I had been born in 1990. I had been their only child. They had not been able to have more children, for reasons that had been part of the difficult period I mentioned. My mother had had complications during my birth that had required a hysterectomy. She had grieved this for years afterward. She had also developed, in the years following, a serious depression that had not been recognized as depression by my father, or by the parish community, or by anybody in their small social circle. She had been thought of as moody. She had been thought of as ungrateful. She had been told, by the women at the parish, to be more cheerful for her husband. By the time I was 6, my mother had stopped being able to function. She had been in bed most days. My father had been working double shifts to keep us housed. My grandfather Alexei, who had become the closest adult to me other than my parents, had died of a heart attack the year before, which had compounded everything. My father had finally gone to the parish priest and had asked for help. The parish priest had connected my father with a couple in the community, the Hollings family, who had been licensed foster parents and who had no children of their own. The Hollings family had agreed to take me in for a few months, while my father got my mother into treatment and tried to stabilize the family. I want to tell you about the Hollings family, because they are the family I am about to describe arriving at my son's scholarship ceremony 16 years later. The Hollings family had been Margaret Hollings, my foster mother, who had been 41 when I had moved in with them, and Walter Hollings, my foster father, who had been 43. They had been comfortable. He had been an insurance agent at a small office in the next town over. She had been a part-time office manager at the local Catholic school. They had lived in a 4-bedroom house in a nicer neighborhood than the small 2-bedroom apartment my parents had been renting at the time. They had been the kind of childless couple who had wanted children for years and had decided, in their late 30s, that they would try to be foster parents because that had been the path their parish had been able to offer them. Margaret had been kind to me at first. She had bought me clothes I had not had before. She had braided my hair every morning. She had taken me to the Catholic school where she had worked, where she had enrolled me as a foster student, and where she had been able to oversee my day-to-day life directly. Walter had been quieter, but warm in the way some men are warm, which is to say he had not been actively unkind. The first few months had been good. What had happened, around month 6, is that my biological parents had been ready to take me back. My mother had been stabilizing on medication. My father had transitioned to a single-shift schedule. They had moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment with a separate room for me. They had been ready. Margaret Hollings had told my father, in a meeting at the parish that I was not present for, but that I would learn about much later, that she did not think I should be returned yet. She had argued that my mother was still fragile. She had argued that the transition would be too hard on me. She had pointed out, in a way that had stung my father, that the Hollings family could offer me a more stable home, a private school education, and a larger network of resources than my biological parents could. The parish priest had agreed with Margaret. My father had not had the resources, the English fluency, or the social capital to push back against the combined recommendation of his foster placement coordinator and his parish priest. He had, in the small, careful way men of his generation handled things they could not control, accepted the recommendation. He had been told that the placement would be extended for another 6 months. The 6 months had become a year. The year had become 2 years. By the time I had been 10, I had been with the Hollings family for 4 years, and my biological parents had been allowed to visit me only twice a year, in supervised settings, at the parish, where Margaret had sat in the room with them and had taken notes for the case file. I want to tell you what Margaret Hollings had been doing during those years. She had been telling me, in small and large ways, that my biological parents had not loved me enough to fight for me. She had been telling me they were difficult and unstable and ungrateful. She had been telling me, by the time I was 9, that they had given me up willingly and that I should not have any guilt about not feeling close to them because they had not actually wanted me back. She had been telling me my father was a man without ambition. She had been telling me my mother was a woman whose mental illness made her a danger to small children. She had been telling me, by the time I was 11, that I was lucky she had taken me in because nobody else in my life had been willing to. I had believed her. I want to be honest about this. I had been a small child being raised by a woman who had been telling me every day for years what my own family had been. I had not had the tools to evaluate the information. I had accepted her version. I had begun, by 10, to actively dread the supervised visits with my biological parents. I had been polite to them at the parish. I had not asked them questions. I had been counting down the minutes until I could go home with Margaret. The placement ended when I was 12. I want to tell you how it ended, because the ending is the part that I have been thinking about for the last 16 years. When I was 12, Margaret Hollings became pregnant. After 11 years of trying, she had become pregnant. The pregnancy had been unexpected. Margaret had been 47. She had been told for 2 decades that she could not have children. She had been given a small medical miracle. She had been delighted. So had Walter. The two of them had immediately begun planning for the baby. Within 3 weeks of finding out about the pregnancy, Margaret had called the foster placement coordinator and had asked to begin the process of returning me to my biological parents. She had explained, on the phone, that the pregnancy had been a high-risk one given her age, and that she would not be able to provide the level of care a foster placement required during the pregnancy and the early years of the baby's life. She had said this in a calm, professional voice. She had not, when she had hung up the phone, sat me down to tell me what she had done. She had let me find out 3 days later, when the foster coordinator had visited the house and had told me that I would be moving back in with my biological parents within the month. I had been 12. I had not understood. I had cried for 2 weeks. Margaret had been mildly comforting, in the way a person is comforting when they are removing a piece of furniture from a room they have decided to redecorate. She had told me that we would still see each other. She had told me she would still be a part of my life. She had told me, when I had asked her why she was sending me back, that the situation had become complicated, and that I would understand when I was older. I had moved back to my biological parents' apartment 6 weeks before Margaret had given birth to her own daughter, a child she had named Bethany, who had been born healthy and who had, from that point forward, been the only child the Hollings family had spoken about. The Hollings family had not stayed in touch with me. Margaret had called my mother twice in the first year to ask how I was doing. The calls had stopped after that. I had seen Margaret a few times at the parish on Christmas. The conversations had been brief. By the time I was 15, the Hollings family had completely disappeared from my life. They had moved to a different parish in a different town. They had been raising Bethany. I want to tell you about the years between 12 and 19, because those years are how my biological parents had become my actual parents. My mother, Irina, had been steady on medication by the time I had returned. My father, Stepan, had been working a stable single shift at the Catholic hospital. The apartment had been small and warm and full of the smell of borscht and the sound of my father playing old Ukrainian folk music on a small record player my grandfather Alexei had left him. My parents had not pushed me. They had let me come back to them at my own pace. They had given me my own small bedroom with a door I could close. They had been gentle with me when I had been difficult. They had been patient with me when I had told them, in the early months, that I missed Margaret. By 14, I had begun to ask my mother questions about why I had been kept away from her for so long. She had told me the truth. She had told me about her depression. She had told me about the parish priest's recommendation. She had told me about Margaret's argument that the Hollings family could provide more. She had told me, very gently, that she had not stopped trying to get me back during those years, but that she had not had the resources to fight what had been a combined recommendation of the parish and the foster placement coordinator. She had told me she had been sorry. She had told me she had loved me every single day of the 6 years she had not been allowed to be my mother. She had cried during the conversation in a way I had not seen her cry before. I had cried too. We had cried in the kitchen of our small apartment together for almost an hour. After that conversation, my biological parents had become, slowly, the people I called Mom and Dad. The transition had been gradual. By 16, I had stopped referring to Margaret as my mother in any way. By 17, I had stopped speaking to the Hollings family at all. By 18, I had been a senior in high school, working a part-time job at a small grocery store, planning to go to community college the following year, and being raised, in the only meaningful sense of the word, by Irina and Stepan Pavlenko. I want to tell you about the year I was 19, because the year is where the rest of the story turns. I had been at community college. I had been studying nursing. I had been dating a boy named Caleb, who I had met at the grocery store, who had been a year older than me, and who had been working as a delivery driver while taking classes at the same community college. We had been together for about 10 months. I had been on birth control, but the pill had been the kind I had been taking inconsistently because I had been working 2 jobs and going to school and forgetting it more often than I should have. I had gotten pregnant in the spring. I had been terrified. Caleb had been terrified. We had been 19 and 20. We had not been ready. I had told my parents in their kitchen, 2 weeks after the positive test. My father had been quiet for a long moment. My mother had stood up, walked around the table, and hugged me. She had said, "Imelda, this is your child. Our family is not going to leave you alone in this. We are going to figure it out together." She had said this in Ukrainian, which was the language my parents had switched to when something serious needed to be said. The word she had used for family had been simya, which had been the word my grandfather Alexei had used in his journalism, which had been a word that, in his usage, had meant the people who had agreed to be tied to each other through whatever was coming. My biological parents had supported me through the pregnancy. They had let me move back in with them. They had cared for me through the difficult 3rd trimester. They had been at the hospital when my son had been born. My mother had been the one holding my hand. My father had been the one who had carried the small car seat to the apartment afterward. They had become grandparents in the way grandparents become grandparents, which is to say they had become it before they had even known they had been ready. Caleb had been part of our lives for 2 more years. He had tried. He had not been able to figure out how to be a father at 21. He had moved away when our son was 2. He sends money. He has been polite about it for 16 years. He calls our son on his birthday. He has been, in the way some men are, the kind of distant father who has not done anything actively wrong but has not built a real relationship either. My son has been kind about it. My son has decided, on his own, that his father is somebody he will know in a particular limited way for the rest of his life. He has not asked for more. I have not asked for more on his behalf. I had married Yarik when my son was 6. Yarik is a metal worker. He builds small sculptures out of scrap metal in a small studio behind our house. He had been my brother's best friend growing up, although I had not had a brother, so I should explain. He had been the son of my parents' closest friends from the parish. He had been 7 years older than me. He had been like an older brother to me when I had been a small child before the foster placement. He had been one of the few people from the parish community who had stayed in touch with my parents during the 6 years I had been with the Hollings family. He had visited my parents many times during those years. He had asked them, every visit, how I had been doing. When I had moved back with my biological parents at 12, Yarik had reappeared in my life as a kind of older cousin. He had become, gradually, a friend. By the time I had been 23, with a 4-year-old son and a job at the hospice and a small 1-bedroom apartment, he had become more than a friend. We had married in a small ceremony at the parish when I had been 26. He had adopted my son officially 2 years later. He had become my son's father in every way that mattered. I want to tell you about my son. His name is Yaroslav. He has been called Yarik by everybody since he was small. He is 17 now. He is a tall, careful, observant boy who got most of his height from my biological father and most of his stillness from Yarik. He plays the cello. He has been playing since he was 8. He is good. He has been good for a long time. He has also been the kind of student who quietly works hard for years without making a big deal about it, which is part of why the scholarship ceremony I am about to tell you about had been a surprise to most of the people in the room, including, until the night of the ceremony, my son himself. The scholarship had been a regional music scholarship for graduating seniors who had been studying classical instruments seriously. The scholarship had been $12,000 a year for 4 years, renewable, awardable for use at any college the recipient chose. The recipients had been chosen from a pool of about 300 applicants from across our county. Yarik had been one of the 3 recipients chosen. The ceremony had been held at the auditorium of our local high school. About 400 people had been invited. The night of the ceremony was a Saturday in May. We had arrived at the auditorium at 6:30 for a 7 o'clock start. My mother and father had come with us. My husband Yarik had come. His older sister, Sevda, had come, with her teenage daughter who had picked out Yarik's green tie. My best friend Lena, who had been my best friend since I had been 21, had come. We had been sitting in the third row when I had noticed Margaret Hollings in the auditorium. I want you to understand, I had not seen Margaret in over 15 years. I had not had any contact with the Hollings family since I was 13. I had not invited them to the ceremony. They had not been on the invitation list. They should not have been in the auditorium. She had been about 10 rows back, on the other side of the aisle. She had been with Walter. She had also been with Bethany, who had been a young woman now, about my age but slightly younger, who I had never met as an adult. The three of them had been holding small printed programs. They had been dressed for a celebration. They had been smiling. My mother had seen them at the same time I had. She had reached over and had put her hand on my arm. She had not said anything. She had simply touched my arm. I had nodded. I had told her, in the small whisper we had used at parish funerals, that I had not invited them. She had nodded back. She had told me, in the same whisper, that she had heard the Hollings family had been donating to the regional scholarship fund for years. She had not known whether they had been donating specifically to the music program. She had told me she had been hoping the seating would not bring this to a head, but that it might. I want to tell you what I had felt in that moment. I had felt a kind of cold I had not felt since I had been 12. The cold had been the cold of remembering that the Hollings family had a relationship with the parish, with the local Catholic school system, with the regional charitable networks, in a way my biological parents had never been able to have. The Hollings family had been the kind of people who showed up at events for kids they had no business showing up for, because their donations had given them the right to show up, and because their long association with the community had made the showing up look normal. I had also felt, beneath the cold, a more specific dread. I had known, by the way, Margaret was already scanning the auditorium with her face turned slightly toward the front row of scholarship recipients, that she had seen Yarik. I had known that she had been planning to approach him at some point in the evening, with Walter and Bethany in tow, as if they had been a kind of extended family who had been there all along. I had known, with the particular clarity that hospice work had taught me about how people behave when they are about to do something self-serving in public, that the Hollings family had come to the ceremony to insert themselves. The ceremony had started at 7. Yarik had been called second of the 3 recipients. He had walked up onto the stage. He had received his certificate. He had shaken the hand of the Regional Scholarship Committee chairperson. He had been invited to say a few words at the microphone, which had been the part of the ceremony none of us had been prepared for, because the program had said only that the recipients would be acknowledged and that the chairperson would speak. The chairperson had told the audience that each recipient would have a chance to say a few words about who they had been thanking. He had told the audience this was a recent addition to the ceremony. He had told the audience this was to recognize, as the scholarship committee had been increasingly aware, that musical scholarship is a community achievement and that the recipients had been wanting to acknowledge the communities behind them. The first recipient had spoken for about 2 minutes. She had thanked her parents, her teacher, her church choir, and her grandmother. She had been brief and polite and well-rehearsed. Yarik had taken the microphone. He had taken it slowly. He had not been holding any notes. He had not, I would later learn, been planning to give a long speech. He had been planning to thank a few people and to sit back down. Then he had looked out into the audience. He had seen, in row 10, on the other side of the aisle, 3 people he had recognized from old photographs my mother had once shown him, who he had not expected to see at his own ceremony, and who had been smiling at him as if they had been part of his story. He had paused. He had taken a breath. He had said, into the microphone, "Thank you. I am going to take a minute. I have a few people I want to thank, and I want to do it carefully." He had paused again. He had looked at me. I had nodded at him, because I had not known what else to do. I had not known what he was about to say. He had said, "I want to thank my mother. Her name is Imelda Pavlenko. She raised me. She has been the only mother I have ever known. I want to thank my father, Yarik Sokolov, who adopted me when I was 8, and who has been my father in every way that matters. I want to thank my grandparents, Irina and Stepan Pavlenko, who are sitting in the 3rd row and who took my mother back when she was 12, after a foster family had given her up because they had finally had a biological child of their own. I want to thank my mother's best friend, Lena, who has been like an aunt to me. I want to thank my cello teacher, Mr. Iosif Bondarenko, who has worked with me for 9 years. The auditorium had been quiet. I had been crying. My mother had been crying. Adric had been holding my hand. I had not yet realized that Yarik was not done. He had said, "I also want to acknowledge a family in row 10, who I see have come tonight. I want to thank them for coming. Their names are Margaret and Walter Hollings, and their daughter Bethany. They were my mother's foster parents when she was a small child. They took her in for 6 years. They gave her back at 12. They are not part of my family. They have not been part of my family for any of the 17 years I have been alive. I want to acknowledge them in this room, in front of this community, because they have come tonight, and because they have been smiling for photographs, and because they have made themselves visible to a network of donors and school officials who I think they are hoping will associate them with this scholarship. I want to make sure, on the record, that this scholarship has nothing to do with them. The people who raised the person who raised me are sitting in the 3rd row. They are my actual grandparents. They are the ones I am thanking tonight. The Hollings family is welcome to stay and watch the rest of the ceremony, but they should not be in any photographs with me, with my mother, or with my grandparents. I am asking them, respectfully, to understand that I have known about them for a long time, and that my mother's silence about them for the last 16 years has not been an invitation. Thank you." He had handed the microphone back to the chairperson. He had walked back down to his seat in the front row. I want to tell you what happened in the auditorium in the next 90 seconds. There had been a long silence. The chairperson had been frozen at the podium. The audience had been frozen in their seats. Several people had turned around to look at the Hollings family. The Hollings family had not moved. Margaret had been holding her program tightly enough that I had been able to see the white of her knuckles from 3 rows away. Walter had been looking at the floor. Bethany had been looking at her mother with a complicated expression that I would later learn had not been entirely sympathetic. Then the chairperson had cleared his throat. He had thanked Yarik. He had moved on to the 3rd recipient, in the small, careful way men handle things they have not been prepared to handle. The ceremony had finished. The applause at the end had been louder than it had been at the start, in the way audiences applaud after they have been put through something complicated together. The Hollings family had left the auditorium before the closing remarks had even ended. They had not stayed for the reception. I want to tell you what happened at the reception. The reception had been in the school cafeteria. The reception had been for the scholarship recipients and their immediate families. Yarik had walked over to me. He had hugged me for a long time. He had not said anything. He had simply hugged me. My mother had hugged us both. My father had stood next to us with his hands in his pockets, looking at his grandson with the kind of expression I had not seen on his face before. Adric had been a few feet away, talking quietly with Lena, who had been wiping her eyes with a small tissue. When Yarik had finally pulled away from me, he had said, "Mom, I am sorry. I had not planned to do that. I had walked up to the microphone planning to thank you and Adric and the grandparents and go back to my seat. When I saw them, I knew I could not let them stay in the photographs. I had to say something. I am sorry I did not warn you." I had told him I was not sorry. I had told him I was proud of him. I want to tell you what he said next, because the next sentence was the sentence that made me understand the rest of the night. He had said, "Mom, I have been thinking about what I would say if I ever saw them at one of my things for a long time. Grandma told me about them when I was 12. She told me she did not know if they would ever try to appear in my life. She told me to be ready. I have been ready since I was 12. I had been hoping I would not need it. I am sorry I needed it tonight." I had looked at my mother. My mother had been standing about 6 feet away from us, holding a small paper plate with a piece of cake on it. She had heard him. She had been looking at me with the look she had been giving me at family events for the last 20 years, which had been the look of a mother who had been quietly doing the work of preparing the next generation for the things she had not been able to fully shield them from. I had said, "Mom, you told him..." She had nodded. She had said, in Ukrainian, "Imelda. I told him at 12 because I was the same age you had been when they sent you back. I wanted him to know what they were capable of. I wanted him to know in case they ever tried to walk into his life pretending they had been part of it. I did not tell you I had told him. because I did not want you to feel like you had to manage his knowing. I wanted him to be able to manage it himself, on his own terms, in his own time. I have been watching him manage it for 5 years. He has done a beautiful job. I am sorry tonight became the night it had to come out. I am also proud of him. I had cried again. I had cried in the small, careful way you cry at a reception when you do not want to make a scene. My mother had handed me her piece of cake. Yarik had brought me a glass of water. Yarik had appeared next to me with another handkerchief from his grandfather's collection. The 4 of us, 3 generations, had stood in the school cafeteria and had eaten cake quietly. I want to tell you what has happened in the months since, because the months are the part of the story I have been thinking about most. The Hollings family did not contact us after the ceremony. We did not contact them. The scholarship was finalized without incident. Yarik will start college in the fall. He has been accepted to a music conservatory program at a small university in Vermont. He will be studying cello performance with a small minor in music education. He has decided he wants to teach. My mother has been telling me, slowly, about the things she had been carrying for the last 16 years that she had never told me. She has told me about how she had felt during the 6 years I had been with the Hollings family. She has told me about the specific things Margaret had said to her over the years that had wounded her. She has told me about her grief at not being able to fight harder for me. We have been having these conversations on Sunday afternoons, in her kitchen, over tea. The conversations have been the closing of a small distance that had been left open between us for a long time, that neither of us had realized had still been there. My father has been teaching Yarik how to play several Ukrainian folk songs on his cello. They have been practicing together in our living room on weekends. My father has been crying during the practices, in the way men of his generation cry when they have spent a long time being quiet about things, and have finally been given a small reason to let some of it out. Yarik has been working on a small metal sculpture in his studio that he has not shown me yet. He has told me he wants to give it to Yarik when he leaves for college. I have left him alone to work on it. I will see it when it is finished. I want to tell you what I have learned. The lesson took me a long time to articulate, and I want to give it to you carefully, because I think there are people listening who have been carrying versions of it without having the words yet. The first thing I have learned is that families do not announce themselves when they are real. Real families show up on Tuesday afternoons. They show up at parish potlucks. They show up in the years between the events, in the small daily ways that nobody photographs. The families that show up only at the events, with the right outfits and the right smiles and the right donations to the right networks, have usually not been doing the daily showing up that would justify their visibility at the events. You can tell the difference between the 2 kinds of families by who comes to the small things. The visible families come to the big things. The actual families have already been in your kitchen, every Sunday, for the previous decade, helping you make food for your son's lunch the next day. The second thing I have learned is that the people who took something from you when you were a child will sometimes try to insert themselves back into your life at the moment of your visible success, not because they care about your success, but because they want to be photographed adjacent to it. They are doing this for themselves. They are doing it because they have been telling themselves, for years, a story about how they were the ones who really raised you, even though they sent you back. They need the photographs to confirm the story. They need the visible association to maintain the narrative they have built about who they are in your life. You do not owe them the photographs. You do not owe them the narrative. You are allowed, in a public way if necessary, to correct the record. The correcting is not cruelty. The correcting is just telling the truth about who showed up. The third thing I have learned is the one that has been hardest to hold, and that I want to say carefully because I am still figuring it out. The people who raised you, in the actual sense of the word, may not always be the people who started raising you. The raising can pass from one family to another. The first family that takes a child does not always end up being the family that raises them. Sometimes the original family, the biological one, has been doing the work of becoming ready while the child has been gone, and the child comes back, and the actual raising happens in the years after the return. 12 is not too late to be raised. 16 is not too late. 20 is not too late. The raising is not just the early years. The raising is also the year you came back. The raising is also the year you turned 19, and the family you had returned to became the family that taught you how to be a mother yourself, by being the kind of family that did not throw you out when you got pregnant. The raising is the people who teach you, by their example, what families are for. The teaching can happen at any age. The teaching is what you remember when you raise the next child. The teaching is what you pass on. The fourth thing I have learned is that children watch carefully, and they remember what they are told, and they make their own decisions about it, often years before we realize they are making them. My son had been preparing, since he was 12, to be the person who walked up to a microphone and corrected a record on his mother's behalf. I had not known he had been preparing. He had been waiting to see if the preparation would ever be needed. The preparation had been a kind of love. The waiting had been a kind of love. The walking up to the microphone, when the moment had finally arrived, had been the kind of love that a parent could spend a whole life hoping a child would be capable of, and that a parent could not actively teach. He had taught himself. My mother had given him the information. My example had given him the choices. He had assembled the rest of it on his own. He had become, somewhere along the way, the kind of 17-year-old who could correct a public record without raising his voice. I had not known I had been raising that kind of son. I had been hoping. The hope is what most parenting actually is. The proof comes later, in moments you do not get to plan, where the child you raised does something you could not have written for him, and you watch him do it, and you understand, in that moment, what the years had actually been adding up to. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me, in the comments, the moment a child in your life corrected a record on your behalf, in front of an audience, in a way you had not asked them to. Tell me how old they were. Tell me what they said. Tell me whether you had known they had been preparing to say it, or whether the saying caught you by surprise. Tell me what they did the day after. Tell me whether anybody who needed to hear what they had said actually changed because of it, or whether the saying was its own purpose, regardless of what the audience did with it. Tell me whether you cried. Tell me whether you have ever thanked them, in plain language, for being the kind of person who would do that for you. There are more of us than the families who tried to insert themselves at the wrong moments would ever understand. We have been raising our children to know the difference, and our children have been growing into the difference. And the difference is what has been carrying us through generations of small public corrections. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.